Chapter 24, An Affluent Society, 1953 to 1960, Part 3 and 4. Part 3. The most significant challenge to 1950s complacency was the greatest citizens' movement of the 20th century, the black struggle for equality. The civil rights movement, though celebrated today, was at the time a great surprise. The causes today seem apparent, from World War II's destabilization of the racial system and the mass migration out of the South that made black voters a larger part of the Democratic coalition, to the Cold War and the rise of the independent Third World, both of which exposed the gap between U.S. rhetoric and realities. But few predicted that a mass movement for civil rights would develop in the South. A few thought that a movement might emerge in the North, but there, blacks' allies and black groups had been damaged by McCarthyism and limited by the racism of union leaders and the exclusively legal strategy of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. The Southern movement instead had its basis in the Southern Black Church, which organized a militant but nonviolent assault on segregation. In the 1950s, the United States was still a segregated and unequal society. Half of America's black families lived in poverty. Because of seniority rules that protected white workers in the industrial workforce, blacks lost their jobs first when the economics soured. In the South, Jim Crow characterized all kinds of separate public institutions, and in the North and West, not law, but custom barred blacks from colleges, hotels, restaurants, and most suburban housing. In 1950, 17 southern and border states and Washington, D.C. required the racial segregation of public schools, and several more states allowed local districts to segregate. Few whites felt it was urgent to challenge racial inequality. With the defeat of Truman's Civil Rights Initiative and the Eisenhower administration's reluctance to confront race relations, segregation was attacked first in the courts. In California, a challenge to segregation there by Latino groups led to the desegregation of public schools in that state in 1946. The governor who signed the measure, Earl Warren, had presided over Japanese-American internment, but after the war he came to oppose racial inequality. Eisenhower appointed Warren as the Supreme Court's Chief Justice in 1953. Meanwhile, the NAACP, led by attorney Thurgood Marshall, continued its campaign of legal challenges to the separate but equal doctrine. By 1950, Supreme Court rulings in several cases suggested that segregated institutions of higher education for blacks were not actually equal to those open only to whites. Marshall soon directly attacked racial segregation in public education. The NAACP worked on several cases challenging the unequal treatment of black children in schools across the country. In 1952, 5 of these cases were combined into a single appeal whose title was the first case listed, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In this case, Marshall attacked not the unfair application of the separate but equal doctrine, but the doctrine itself. He argued that even with the same funding and facilities, segregation was unequal because it stigmatized one group of citizens as unfit to associate with others. Using psychological studies, Marshall stated that segregation inflicted lifelong damage on black children by undermining their self-esteem. The Eisenhower administration, in a brief on the case, urged the court to recognize the damage segregation inflicted on America's reputation abroad in the context of the Cold War. The new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, read the unanimous decision on May 17, 1954, which stated that segregation in public education violated the equal protections of the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, thus striking down the separate but equal doctrine protecting segregation. Although hailed by the black press as a second Emancipation Proclamation, the decision did not outlaw segregation in institutions other than public schools or ban racial classification in the law. It did not address de facto school segregation in the North based on residential segregation rather than state law. It did not order immediate implementation, but only hearings on how segregation in schools should be abolished. But the Brown decision signaled the beginning of the Warren Court as an active agent of social change, and it gave hope to many that segregation would soon end. The Brown decision animated civil rights activists who, after being rather dormant in the early 1950s, now believed that federal courts would back them. Mass action against Jim Crow developed quickly. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks, a black department store worker in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to surrender her seat on a city bus to a white rider, as local law was requiring. Parks' arrest provoked a year-long bus boycott, which initiated the mass phase of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Within a decade, the Civil Rights Revolution overthrew legal segregation and regained the right to vote for black Southerners. While Parks was depicted as an ordinary woman fed up with Jim Crow, In fact, she was a veteran of civil rights struggles in the 1930s and 40s. With news of her arrest spreading through Montgomery, hundreds of blacks gathered in a local church and refused to ride the bus until they received equal treatment. For more than a year, despite harassment and violence, Montgomery's blacks boycotted. In November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation in public transportation unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott launched a nonviolent movement for racial justice based in the South's black churches. It was supported by Northern liberals and focused unprecedented international attention on U.S. racial policies. Through the boycott, Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor at a local Baptist church, became the movement's symbol. At the boycott's first protest meeting, King inspired his audience when he said that Southern blacks were tired of going through the long night of captivity and were reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. From its beginning, the language of freedom marked the black movement. Freedom meant many different things, but most of all, it meant political rights and economic opportunities long denied because of skin color. King's rhetoric united ideas of freedom into a coherent whole. His most famous speech, I Have a Dream, given in 1963, began by noting the unfulfilled promise of emancipation and closed by invoking a cry from a black spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. King appealed to both blacks' sense of injustice and the conscience of white America by making the case for black rights in terms that united blacks' experience with that of the nation. A student of nonviolent civil disobedience, as proposed by Henry David Thoreau and Gandhi, King offered a philosophy of struggle in which evil was met by good, hate with Christian love, and violence with peaceful demands for change. His Christian themes came from the black church, and they resonated in the black community in America. He appealed to white America by emphasizing blacks' loyalty to the nation and their devotion to its redemptive values. In 1956, building on success in Montgomery, King formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a coalition of black ministers and civil rights activists to organize desegregation efforts. But the fact that Montgomery's officials agreed to desegregate only when forced to do so by a Supreme Court ruling showed that more than local action was necessary to end Jim Crow. The white South's refusal to accept the Brown decision showed that blacks would win their constitutional rights only by federal intervention. But the federal government did not step in to the breach. Southern whites did, launching a campaign of massive resistance against desegregation in the South. In 1956, a full 82 of 106 Southern congressmen signed a Southern manifesto condemning Brown as an abuse of judicial power and calling for lawful resistance to forced integration. Southern states soon passed laws to block desegregation, and some even outlawed the NAACP. Virginia was the first state to enact desegregation but offer funds to white students, but not blacks, to attend private schools. Some localities shut down their schools entirely rather than desegregate. The federal government tried to stay uninvolved. In 1957, Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson led successful efforts in Congress to pass the first national civil rights law since Reconstruction, focusing on black voters' rights in the South, but it had weak enforcement and little effect. President Eisenhower offered no moral leadership and called only for Americans to obey the law, while he publicly made it clear that he did not welcome civil rights agitation. In 1957, when Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas used the National Guard to prevent the court-ordered integration of Little Rock Central High School, Eisenhower dispatched federal troops to the city to enforce it. Elsewhere, the federal government did little to hasten desegregation. Since the Cold War's beginnings, U.S. leaders worried that segregation tarnished America's reputation abroad. This continued in the late 1950s. Moreover, foreign nations and colonies also noticed the development of civil rights in America. Across the world, people of African descent celebrated the Brown decision, but the slow pace of change led to embarrassing criticisms of American diplomats. Chapter 24, Part 4. The presidential campaign of 1960 was one of the closest in American history. The Republican Vice President Richard Nixon faced off against Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy, a young Massachusetts senator and Roman Catholic whose father had been U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Lyndon B. Johnson ran as Kennedy's vice presidential candidate. Although World War II's atmosphere of tolerance had weakened anti-Catholicism, it persisted in claims that the church was undemocratic, repressive, and un-American. Many Protestants were weary of voting for Kennedy, fearing that a Catholic president would follow church dictates in controversial public policy issues. Kennedy tried to dismiss such fears by disavowing any connection between his public positions and his church. Kennedy secured that the Democratic nomination after he won the primary in the heavily Protestant West Virginia, and he soon faced off against Nixon. Both candidates were ardent Cold Warriors, but Kennedy argued that the Soviet Union's success in launching Sputnik, the first Earth satellite, into orbit, and their tests of the first intercontinental ballistic missiles showed that the United States under the Republicans had let a missile gap develop and was lagging behind the USSR in the Cold War. Both Kennedy and Nixon knew that the U.S. military and economic capacity was far greater than that of the Soviets. But Kennedy's criticisms convinced many Americans that new leadership was needed. Kennedy's stylish wife, Jacqueline, also charmed many Americans, who seemed to want a young and energetic first family. In the first ever televised presidential debate, the handsome Kennedy bested Nixon, who had a cold and seemed tired and nervous. Those who listened to radio thought Nixon had won the debate, but in fact, Kennedy won by a very narrow margin, winning the popular vote by only 120,000. In January of 1961, shortly before leaving office, President Eisenhower delivered a televised farewell address. Ike warned against the new military buildup and urged Americans to think about the dangers of what he called a military-industrial complex that conjoined an enormous military establishment with a permanent arms industry and greatly influenced politicians and policy. He warned that such an establishment should never endanger our liberties or democratic processes. But most Americans saw the military-industrial establishment not as a threat, but as a source of jobs and national security. The Vietnam War soon made Ike's words of caution seem very relevant. By the 1960s, the foundations of 1950s life seemed to be collapsing. Cars and the chemicals produced and released by new consumer goods were found to be spoiling the environment and giving people cancer. Housewives rebelled against roles given to them in suburban families, and blacks became impatient with the slow pace of racial progress. The 1960s had arrived.